Of the Historical Society of Frankfurt, and I'd like to welcome everybody here. This is the biggest crowd that we've had in the building in 2.5 years, and I'm excited to announce this is the first time in 2.5 years we will be serving refreshments after the meeting. We have a very exciting program in store for you tonight. We have Alex Palma from Carpenters Hall, but before we get to that, we have some other housekeeping business to take care of. So I'd like to introduce our board member, Fred Prescott.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and good to see some faces out again. I just want to make it small enough, but it's kind of a reminder that over in the back corner of the building, where that little desk is and the table, we now call that memory lane. And what it's intended to do, it's user-friendly. We want you to go in there, sit there, take a binder off the shelf, and sit there and read it. It's people's memories of Frankfurt. And you're more than welcome. The binders are there. You can flip through them. There's a couple that don't have much in it, like where I worked in Frankfurt. So we need people to remember what happened in their time in Frankfurt. You're part of history, and we need your history. You can't find everything in newspapers. We need word of mouth from the people who lived here and did things here and worked here. So anytime you get a chance, you get a few minutes, that's a place you can go where there's hands-on information over there. And hopefully, you'll take a few minutes and add some numbers yourself. We'd like to know who your families are. That's one of the hardest things. Sometimes we get requests for people that we don't know, but maybe their family is in that book. So, and everybody said, oh, I can't do this. Yes, you can. How many times have you sat down and said, hey, remember when I was 16, we did this, or we went there, or something happened on the avenue? You can do it. Sit down, jot down a few notes. If you don't care, if you don't feel comfortable writing down a whole paper, give it to us. I'll transpose it, put it in our file, but before it goes into that book, everything goes to the writer for final approval. I don't want to put anything in there you didn't do or you didn't remember. So you're more than welcome to stop by. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm John Buffington. I'm the program chair for the society. Before I forget, we need to remind everybody to turn off your cell phones if you have them, because they will interfere with the way that we broadcast this program. Our speaker tonight, Alex Palma, has one of the most impressive credentials I've ever seen, which is that when Jerry and I heard him do the introductory talk at Carpenters Hall, because we were there for a meeting of another organization, Jerry, on the way out of the building, said to me, you know, he's so good, we need to recruit him for one of our programs. So that's what we did, and it was before we found out that he also had the good sense to move to Frankfurt. So it's a double hit for us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being in Frankfurt now, almost, quarter of your day, I guess. And we're delighted to have him. He is the assistant curator at the Carpenters Company, and an authoritative source, I can tell you because I heard you talk too, an authoritative source on the general history of the Carpenters Company, which is, by the way, one of the absolutely most important historical sites in Philadelphia. It's a little bit behind Independence Hall, but that doesn't mean it's less important for reasons that perhaps you'll hear or perhaps I'll bring out in the question session. I want to also plead with everybody here and everybody who sees this in the next, let's say, month, to be in touch with us about what you think about programming, because we're really kind of at a decision point in the society, having just become a broadcaster as a result of the pandemic. Good thing, too, because we might have failed. Might well have failed if we hadn't had a couple of technologically adept board members. But we're up and running, and we're going to keep doing both. We're going to keep doing hybrid programs. Live people here, we want our people to come back, and we're delighted to see an increase tonight. Plus, we're going to keep broadcasting. We know what we're going to do for the next several programs, but we're not exactly sure that we're finding our way right for sort of where the sweet spot is, keeping on good terms with our people who show up live, which is local people who are interested in local issues, local historical issues, and maybe interested in a little more granularity in Frankfurt history, as opposed to who knows who you people are out there that are watching this that aren't actually Frankfurt exiles. We need you to give us some feedback, please. Tell us what you like and don't like about the trend here in these programs. But I'll tell you quickly what we've already settled on for the next few months. In October, now it's always the second Tuesday at 7:30 in the not terribly hot months and the not terribly cold months, so not July and August, not January, February. In October, we have two very important Philadelphia lawyers who are going to talk about the fact that we've just celebrated the 300th anniversary of the Pennsylvania Constitution. I hope that's going to be the first in an annual series on the evolution of the rule of law here in Pennsylvania, which is really crucial to the evolution of the rule of law in America generally. I think it's going to be very, very interesting, this talk, and if we get some support for continuing the series. November, we're celebrating, that's November 8th, we're celebrating this is now the centennial of the Frankfurt L with Harry Garforth, who's a SEPTA retiree, also a very authoritative source on that subject. And he's going to also give some background on the rail systems that existed through Frankfurt prior to the L. Now that has a lot of national importance too, because we just have been, we were, at least at that point, in the leading edge of the creation of transportation systems in America. Oh yeah. Harry is coming out with a book which we hope will be available at the point of at the point when he gives his talk. In December, we have an authoritative speaker on the subject of of the Swedenborgian Church in Frankfurt, of which we are a little uninformed here largely. There's some stuff, I guess, in our records, but most of the board members do not know about the history of the Swedenborgian Church, and we're going to love hearing about that. April, Brian Sigmund, who's with the Sons of Union Veterans, is going to demonstrate contemporaneous drums with the ones that are in our museum. That is, we have some from the 1860s and maybe before, I don't know, we'll have to check on that. So we've got a lot of, we're open in March of 2023. And then in May of I guess we're at 2024 here. No, okay. I've got a talk coming up on the history of the Philadelphia Sound. Guy in California, I think we've lost the note. Guy in California who, excuse me, has done live interviews with the people who originally developed what was called the Philadelphia Sound popular music. So there's a lot of stuff coming. But if you have ideas for how we should continue to develop our program schedule, we would love to hear from you. You can get through to us through the website. So with that, Alex Palma.
Thank you, John. Can everyone hear me okay? All right? You're recording good? Okay, cool. How is everybody? Nice to see you all. You'll have to forgive me for sitting because I have to stay aligned with the camera, and you'll also have to forgive me for having typed notes. I started my career as a tour guide, and we would try to memorize as much as we could, but with the help of Richard and Susan, I did a bunch of original research for this. So I wanted to make sure that I had everything kind of lined up and straight when I told you about it. That way I'm not telling you little lies. But anyway, so yes, I'm Alex. I work at Carpenters Hall. I've been there for 5 years. And I am really honored to give this talk tonight. Partially, or perhaps entirely, because I'm now a resident of this neighborhood. And it's, I feel like it's important for me to talk about the history of this place, contribute to the history of this place, as you should all. Like Fred said, if you've lived here, especially if you've lived here for a while, you should think about yourselves as being actors in history, right? If only like on a sort of existential human level, even. But so anyway, Carpenters Hall, pictured here, is not in Frankfurt. It's an old city. It's at 3rd and Market, 3rd and Chestnut Streets. I would invite you all down to visit me, but currently our building is undergoing renovations related to preservation issues. So we're waterproofing the foundation, we're reflashing the roof. It's a long, involved project, so we're actually closed to the public until January. Until then, we have a kiosk at the visitor center at 6th and Market, so come by there and say hi if you'd like. But tonight, I'm visiting you guys. And as I said, this evening I'm going to present on the history of the Carpenters Company and the history of Carpenters Hall. Because I only have you all for the next 45 minutes or an hour or so, it's kind of going to be a highlight reel history. But part of that history is going to be touching on the relationship between Carpenters Hall and Frankfurt, which is something I've been looking into, and I found a few really exciting connections. Again, this research was done with the wonderful assistance of Susan and Richard and the wonderful company of the others here at the Society, and I hope you find it interesting. But before we really get into it full tilt, I have to give credit where credit's due. While I was going through the archives upstairs, I discovered that I was not the first person to give a talk on Carpenters Hall here at the Historical Society of Frankfurt. You can see here that in 1944, a talk was given by A. Raymond Raff, who gave at least a few talks here in his day. Interestingly, I did some digging in our records at Carpenters Hall, and I discovered that Mr. Raff was very likely a Carpenters Company member. So our records show that an Albert Raymond Raff was elected to the Carpenters Company in 1893 and died actually just a few years after this talk in 1947. So he may have been retired and living here in Frankfurt, and at that time may have been a member of the society. But what is the Carpenters Company? What is Carpenters Hall? The Carpenters Company was itself founded in 1724 and set out to act as a mutual aid network and a regulatory body for the Philadelphia construction trade. It is a descendant organization of a much older trade organization, an English trade organization called the Worshipful Company of Carpenters in London. That organization goes back at least to the 12th century, based on their records that they have over there in London. So when Penn founded Philadelphia in 1682, and when Thomas Home began laying out the city, there was a call that went up amidst the builders of sort of the English trades. Word got out that Penn was looking for people to build his city. And especially there was a call amongst the Quakers that were living in London to come to Philadelphia and help Penn build this place that was supposed to be a little bit more accommodating for them, right? And so this initial wave that came here, and especially their children, would become the founding generation of the Carpenters Company. And so originally the Carpenters Company was a very Quaker organization. And if you go into Carpenters Hall, you'll see that it's laid out very similarly to a Quaker meeting house. The proportions, the way that things are laid out, the way that they would set out the chairs, and the leadership style have a lot of echoes to the style of the Quaker meeting. So carpenters, builders, build things, right? That's their job. And so what is it that the Carpenters Company has built? After the company's initial founding, the organization held its proceedings most likely in taverns and homes of prominent members, and it was there that they kind of collaborated on construction projects and helped fill out sort of those initial early building regulations that existed in Philadelphia. And 50 years on, something that they built that's important to them is obviously Carpenters Hall itself, right? So Carpenters Hall is a Carpenters Company project. It was built in 1774, 50 years after the original founding of the company. And it was designed by a prolific Scottish architect, Robert Smith. Now, Robert Smith designed not only Carpenters Hall, but he designed the steeple of Christ Church, which you'll see in the second picture there. He designed the Old Pine Presbyterian Church on Pine Street, as well as St. Peter's. He designed the original iteration of Franklin Court, not the Ghost House. And so he was a really big deal. And for the Carpenters Company to not only have him as a member, but to have him as the guy that designed their building, that would have been a real catch for them at that time. So Christ Church, founded in 1695, it had kind of a temporary wooden building until 1744. We don't really know who built the kind of original building, but we do know that the steeple was built, as I said, by Robert Smith and also by Joseph Thornhill, who will come up later. The original wooden structure was probably also built by a Carpenters Company member named George Harrison, not the Beatle. Is there a Beatle named George Harrison? But not the same guy. So also, interestingly, we can lay claim to City Tavern, which is on my screen on the left. I think it's on your left too. City Tavern was designed by a Carpenters Company member named Thomas Proctor between 1771 and 1773. City Tavern was the premier tavern in Philadelphia, but it's not the only tavern we're going to talk about tonight. Also we have Independence Hall here on the far right. Independence Hall, then known as the Pennsylvania State House, where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was formed, was designed by Carpenters Company member Edmund Woolley between 1732 and 1748. So these are some just like the really well-known tourist site kind of places that the Carpenters Company contributed to as an organization. But I want to focus particularly on City Tavern for the moment, because City Tavern was completed in 1773, and in 1774, the First Continental Congress was held in Philadelphia. And so the delegates briefly gathered at City Tavern before proceeding to the next meeting place, which was Carpenters Hall. So the real sort of national significance of Carpenters Hall comes from the 6 weeks that are listed here on this slide. September 5th to October 22nd, 1774. And over those 6 weeks, 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 original American colonies met to discuss the prevailing political issues of their time, right? And I think this was actually kind of ironic, because Carpenters Hall has a really long history. So 2024 is the 250th anniversary of the building and the 300th anniversary of the company itself, right? And for most of its history, actually up until today, the Carpenters Company has been an important sort of element, lodestone, focal point, whatever, in Philadelphia's built environment. So obviously we designed all these buildings and contributed to this landscape, but the company itself was really essential to a lot of the things that are kind of part and parcel with the experience of building anything today, right? So the company acted as a regulatory body, as I said. They established building standards, labor standards, aesthetic standards. They set wages, and that was something that was like really important for the company up until about modern day. But in any case, I'll get back to this. So the delegates formed the First Continental Congress as a direct result of the Boston Tea Party, following years of growing tensions between the British metropole in England and the American colonies. The British Empire kind of passed down the intolerable acts onto the Americans here in the colonies, and there was an explosion of rioting and property destruction in Boston that led to a blockade of Boston Harbor and a martial law being instituted over there. And so anyway, the delegates are kind of responding to this as they all meet in Carpenters Hall. And they choose to meet at Carpenters Hall because it's a relatively private space with a library on the second floor. That library was actually the library company, which is one of the oldest lending libraries in America. It was Benjamin Franklin's library, and at the time, the delegates were allowed to use it in their proceedings over the 6 weeks. So between the sort of guaranteed privacy and the access to the library, Carpenter's Hall was a natural pick. Joseph Galloway, who was one of the more conservative Pennsylvania delegates, would have preferred the delegates to meet instead at the Pennsylvania State House, which was the seat of the colonial government at the time. And so his hope was that it would discourage the radicals in Massachusetts delegates from being overly radical in their language and help to cool tensions. So the push to meet at Carpenter's Hall was actually a deliberate political choice by the Massachusetts and the Massachusetts delegates and the more pro-revolution factions that existed at that time, to kind of try to have a more safer pro-revolution space to discuss these issues. So after these 6 weeks, the delegates together produced the Articles of Association, which was a document that tightened the bonds between the individual colonies, right? So you have to imagine that in 1774, the 13 colonies were, for all intents and purposes, 13 different countries, right? They all had their own colonial assemblies, they all had their own economy, they all had their own currency. And outside of their own currency, they had a couple different foreign currencies that were floating around. And they all have different cultures, different religion, and this kind of helped tighten the idea of a unified American concept. It wasn't complete, right? That would take a couple more years to develop, would probably be best articulated in the Declaration of Independence. But this was an interesting and important prequel to that. Next up, the delegates put together a petition that pled with King George to repeal the Intolerable Acts. And if you go and read the language of this petition, it's actually really interesting because they make all these kind of polite gestures to the king in the language of the petition. So they say things like, oh, King George, there must be some rogue elements in your cabinet that are making you act this way. So they're not yet ready to really openly criticize the king. When the Congress closes, they all have a toast to King George. So it's interesting the politics playing out here at this time. Finally, the delegates affirmed the Suffolk Resolves. So the Suffolk Resolves came out of New York following the Boston Tea Party, and they called for a sort of a general armament of the colonies. And so since the Continental Congress affirms that, they essentially enter an arms race against the British. So the delegates leaving this, they are not in a state of revolution, but they basically set up everything that they need to set up to initiate a revolution. Whether or not they knew that, I think is kind of up to debate. The delegates agreed to meet 1 year later in 1775, but they never meet again at Carpenter's Hall for a Continental Congress, because in 1775, Lexington and Concord breaks out and the American Revolution starts proper. So the Second Continental Congress would be at Independence Hall. So another couple of really important events that happened at Carpenter's Hall are the Bon Voila affair and the what I'll only say now is the bank robbery, right? So in December 1775, December 18th to December 27th, about 4 men secretly met at Carpenter's Hall in the dead of night. Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Francis Damon, who was the librarian of the library company at the time. He was French. And then a French spy named Julian Alexander Accard Bonnevolar, which is some name. I'm terrible at pronouncing it. But Bonnevolar was a French spy sent to America by the French government to size up the American cause, right? You have to imagine this is pre 24-hour-a-day cable news. So, you know, the French are getting word of the revolution happening, but they're really not sure how large it is. They're not sure how serious it is. They don't know how well trained the American Continentals are. So Bonnevolar goes to America to basically figure out if it's worth supporting the Americans to try to undermine the British. And after a week of meeting, and with Francis Damon sort of acting as a translator, Bonnevolar goes back to France, where he advocates that to King Louis that the Americans have access to a port in the south of France. And out of that port, they would trade goods that were necessary to the war, but later on, especially, they would trade gunpowder. And so there are estimates that by the end of the American Revolution, between 75% and 90% of all American gunpowder is actually French in origin, which is massively important considering you need gunpowder to fight a war. And this is important because if you guys know your Revolutionary era history, you'll know that one of the reasons why the Americans lost the Battle of Bunker Hill is because they ran out of ammunition. And so, yeah, this was a huge logistical win. And in this meeting at Carpenters Hall, when you combine this sort of illicit meeting with the meeting of the First Continental Congress, these are two game-changing events, and they make Carpenters Hall one of the most important buildings in American Revolutionary era history. A story that's not as well known, that I think is much more amusing, not that these first two stories aren't important, but in 1798 there was a bank robbery at Carpenters Hall. At the time, the Bank of Pennsylvania had rented a vault and some office space at Carpenters Hall. This was common, right? So the first bank in the United States had rented space. The Bank of North America had rented space from Carpenters Hall. And throughout our history, there have been all these organizations that have either rented space from us or used our space for things. And so a lot of our history is kind of just like almost history by association because of sort of who was around. And so 1798, right, the yellow fever epidemic, which started in 1793, was still happening in Philadelphia. And a lot of people fled the city to escape the plague, including a blacksmith pictured here, Patrick Lyon. Before he left the city, however, he was called to do one last job, and that's changing the hinges on the vault door at Pennsylvania Bank at Carpenters Hall. So by the time, so Lyon had his shop at, I think it was 5th and Chestnut. He goes down with his apprentice, changes the hinges, and then goes to Lewisville, or Lewistown rather. Lewistown, no, it is Lewisville, I had it the first time. Lewisville, Delaware, to take refuge from the yellow fever. By the time he gets there, however, his name is all over the papers because the Bank of Pennsylvania had been robbed the night after he left, and he was the prime suspect. So $162,821 was stolen from the vault at Pennsylvania Pennsylvania Bank, which today would be about $3 million, right? So he gets to Delaware, and Lyons instantly comes back to Philadelphia. And when he attempts to come back. He can't take the ferry because the city is under a kind of quarantine. He can't take a stagecoach. And the entrances to the city, or at least the major ones, are guarded. So he has to infiltrate the city. He comes back, comes to Philadelphia, kind of makes himself known that, and he's arrested and he's put in Walnut Street Prison at 6th and Walnut. And there he remains for several months. Meanwhile, the real culprits, Isaac Davis and Matthew Cunningham, were weaseling away the money that they stole. And so this is funny to me because Matthew Cunningham was an employee of the Bank of Pennsylvania, and Isaac Davis was a member of the Carpenters Company. So not only is this a double inside job, which is to me so funny, but this robbery is the first known bank robbery in American history. So this is, in its own way, a really significant moment. When Matthew Cunningham dies of yellow fever, Davis panics and begins to deposit the money back in the bank, which leads him to fall under suspicion. Davis is eventually caught, but he escapes imprisonment because of political connections that he has to the governor of Pennsylvania at the time. And he basically has to just return the money. Patrick Lyon is released from jail and sues the Bank of Pennsylvania for $12,000, which today is probably about $75,000. And he, of course, wrote a book about the whole affair, and he goes around and gives speeches. And so Patrick Lyon becomes really, really famous in his day for this kind of vindication, right? And so this image of him is actually at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. I'm not sure if you all have ever seen it, but it is huge. He has it painted in the 1820s by John Nagel, who is one of an early American romantic artist. And this painting is so big and so expensive that it actually comes to define American portraiture for the 19th century, right? And so the painting is like, it's kind of hard to describe how large it is based on. So you see how wide those double doors are? It's about, if you took those double doors and stacked them, that's how large the painting is. It's huge. And I know that this image is slightly obscured, but those of you who are familiar with Wilson Peale, what's his first name? Charles Wilson Peale portraits of the 18th century, right? Am I allowed to ask questions? Can I kind of do audience response stuff? Do you guys notice anything different about those? Compared to sort of like normal 18th century portraits?
It's a member of the working class.
There you go. That's one part of it. I know the picture is kind of covered by the other one. But you're right? So this is a image of Patrick Lyon as a working class, or at least a trade, sort of middle class person, right? Most 18th century portraiture was just for gentlemen and gentlewomen. And so Patrick Lyon asked for this deliberately because by the time he had written his book and won his lawsuit, I mean, he was a gentleman himself. But he had himself painted just as a normal blacksmith to say, like, I was right back then, and now look, I'm even more right because of all this money I have. It's like he was really throwing it in everyone's face. And so it's a very dramatic image for the time. He's at the anvil, he's about to hammer away. His apprentice is in the background, and in the background behind him still is a cupola, right? And so there is some scholarly debate as to whether or not that cupola is of Walnut Street Jail or if it's of Carpenters Hall, because both would have had a cupola like that. So, I always like to think it's Carpenters Hall, but I'm obviously biased. Carpenters Hall also has like this fabulous history of being connected to other significant trade organizations, right? So the Bricklayers Union, the Bricklayers International, started in Philadelphia at Carpenters Hall. Again, they rented space from us. The American Institute of Architects, the AAA, has important connections to our organization. And a really big one is the General Building Contractors Association, the GBCA. They came around in the late 19th century because they felt that the Carpenters Company wasn't living up to its original, purpose of sort of being like a trade organization, right? Because in the 1870s, it was the centennial of the United States, and the company was really, really concerned with capturing that history and interpreting it to the public, right? Carpenters Hall opens as a museum in 1856, making us one of the oldest museums in Philly, maybe in America. But that museum definitely kind of leads to different responsibilities for the company itself, as opposed to just being a trade organization. COVID affected us. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about this because after this is all, I'm going to be talking about Frankfurt stuff after this. At the program that John was at, this was one of the slides, and we were at the time asked to kind of comment on how COVID-19 affected us as a museum, and I'm sure that you guys at the Historical Society are really affected by the pandemic. Small institutions having to kind of deal with stuff, and I was thinking about it because I think that a lot of what you guys have done is similar to what we ended up doing. I mean, we launched this online programs thing at Carpenters Hall, and it was something that we would have never tried, right, if the pandemic hadn't forced us to close. So that was interesting, and I'm in a way I'm glad that we tried it because it's really led to a lot of depth in our programming that wouldn't have otherwise been there. We lost a lot of our volunteers, and still have lost some. Not that it's their fault, but because the pandemic is obviously dangerous. And I don't think that you guys dealt with this as much as we would have, but we had a really strict capacity limit that was enforced on us by the city government. So we were like counting people and are we enforcing masks today? Are we not enforcing masks? Are we enforcing vax? Or are we not? There was a lot of back and forth that we went through, and it was difficult to kind of keep on top of what we were supposed to be doing, right? And plus, everybody got mad at you. Like, we always had some blow up, once a day after we reopened initially, and we had the mask mandate about people not wanting to wear masks or whatever. But we're on the other side of it now. Hopefully, I'm thankful. Still have to be safe, but for those of you on the outside of organizations like this, I mean, I think we all have been through it, man. We all have been through it. Okay, so next slide. So the Carpenters Company and Frankfurt. That's what I especially wanted to talk to you all about tonight. I was lucky enough to do some original research for this. But as I was doing the research, I realized that there's so much more work to do. There's so much more work. Finding these connections, teasing them out, kind of encouraging them to reach their full bloom. But I'm going to talk about what I have, because what I have is significant. So, as you all may know, the village of Frankfurt was founded separately from the city of Philadelphia. In the same year, however, 1682, in 1800, Frankfurt was incorporated into a borough. And in 1854, the city of Philadelphia consolidated consolidated Philadelphia County into Philadelphia, the city, right? So at that point, Frankfurt became part of the city of Philadelphia. It's difficult to know the full extent of the connections between the company and that early village of Frankfurt because of the early political separation. You know, Frankfurt, Philly, separate. But also because there was a great loss of Carpenters Company records that happened in 1777, right? So when the British occupied the city of Philadelphia, the president of the company had his house burned down by the British, possibly in retribution for the First Continental Congress. And so we lost all of our records, or the great majority of our records, prior to that point. It's a little bit easier to identify the more recent connections, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So what I want to talk about in the next few slides is just some of my preliminary findings that the volunteers here helped me kind of tie together. But I just want you to know that there's definitely a more robust picture to eventually be developed. So this is something I discovered recently, actually. Something that I discovered with the help of one of our current Carpenters Company members, Jim Clearkin, who couldn't make it tonight, but I'm thankful that he showed me this. So his family's company, James J. Clearkin Incorporated, was founded in 1918 on Wingo Hawking Street. And so their business has been in Frankfurt up until 2006, so almost 100 years, I guess like 85 or 90 years. I'm not so good at math. But while they were here, they contributed to the Reading Railroad Station. These photos here are from the Reading Railroad construction. They contributed to the Sears Roebuck Distribution Center, and they contributed also to the McGregory's Five and Dime that was in the neighborhood. So this is the McGregory's. I'm not sure where this was actually. It might not have actually been in Frankfurt, but he made it seem like it was close by. In any case, I'm thankful to Jim for alerting this to me because I would have never discovered this on my own. And this definitely is indicative to me that there's more work to be done in this research. But anyway, so we go on. The Jolly Post was an inn that was in Frankfurt, and it was definitely one of the hubs, if not the hub, in the village of Frankfurt, and a notable stop on Kings Highway. The land was set aside for Henry Waddy, one of the founders of Frankfurt, in 1680, and it was eventually sold to John Worrell, who we talked about during my research. And so John Worrell was a relative of Joseph Worrell, who was a significant and prominent Carpenters Company member. And eventually the Worrells in turn sold it to Joseph Thornhill. Now Joseph Thornhill was the same Joseph Thornhill who I mentioned before helped build Christchurch steeple, right? So Joseph Thornhill owned the Jolly Post from 1748 until about 1787. And then in 1787, he finally sold it. So he owned it throughout the Revolutionary period. And that's going to come up as something that's important later. The Jolly Post eventually closed in 1911, and it was demolished. But the museum downstairs has some significant artifacts, as you can see, signposts, building elements from the Jolly Post. So this is downstairs. If you guys haven't been, I don't think the museum's open right now, but you should definitely come back and see it because it's really interesting. And so they have a lot of artifacts related to the Jolly Post, including these two portraits of some innkeepers here. This is a signature of Joseph Thornhill's, this is Joseph Thornhill's signature in our roll book at Carpenters Hall. And as you can see, this is dated from 1777. The Frankfurt Advice. You guys have probably all heard of this. This is new to me, but I think it's really interesting. So the story goes like this, right? On August 29th, 1774, only a few weeks before the beginning of the First Continental Congress, the Massachusetts delegates, John Adams and others, stopped in Frankfurt on their way to Carpenters Hall in Philadelphia. There, they are met with some of the more radical and Whiggish Pennsylvania delegates. Those Pennsylvania delegates recommend that Massachusetts take a back seat and allow Virginia to take a lead in the growing movement that they were all experiencing. Their hope was Virginia would in turn entice the other southern states into joining the cause. Because, I said before, 12 of the 13 colonies came to the First Continental Congress. The one that didn't come was Georgia, and the other southern states were similarly reluctant to join the cause. And so isn't it interesting then that Thomas Jefferson was eventually appointed to write the Declaration of Independence from Virginia, and George Washington is selected as the commander of the Continental Army. In this letter to Timothy Pickering, who was Secretary of State, former Secretary of State at this time, Adams reflects, this is years later, this is in 1822. So he says, before the First Continental Congress, we were met at Frankfurt by Dr. Rush, Mr. Mifflin, Mr. Bayard, and several others of the most active Sons of Liberty in Philadelphia who desired conference with us. We invited them to take tea with us in a private apartment. They asked leave to give us some information and advice, which we thankfully granted. He's kind of vague about this here. And so later in that same letter, he says, you inquire why so young a man as Jefferson was placed at the head of the committee for preparing the Declaration of Independence. I answer it was the Frankfurt Advice to place Virginia at the head of everything, right? So we don't know exactly where this meeting was, but it was probably either at the Jolly Post or McVeigh's Tavern, right? And I, again, biased, but I particularly think it was at the Jolly Post because not only was the Jolly Post owned by Joseph Thornhill at the time, and the company had its loyalists, don't get me wrong, but the company definitely leaned pro-revolution, as you can guess by the fact that the company hosted the First Continental Congress. And another reason that I think the Jolly Post might have been the tavern is because one of the Pennsylvania delegates was Samuel Rhodes. We don't know for sure that he was at this meeting of the Frankfurt Advice, but he was one of the delegates. And Samuel Rhodes was a Carpenters Company member. So there is at least one person that was a delegate to the First Continental Congress and a Carpenters Company member. Samuel Rhodes is probably best known for being the architect behind Pennsylvania Hospital. So very interesting, again, more to develop, but to me that's a really fascinating story and super important connection between Frankfurt and Carpenters Hall, because after this Frankfurt Advice, these delegates would proceed directly to Carpenters Hall. Well, they would stop at some tavern first, but you know what I mean. So next up, I want to talk about Port Royal. Port Royal was a stately mansion that was between Tacony and Frankfurt Creek, built for Philadelphia merchant Edward Stiles in 1762. Stiles was born in Port Royal, Bermuda in 1720, which is probably where the name of the mansion came from. The building was designed by Gunning Bedford, a prominent, again, Carpenters Company member, and it was measured by Thomas Neville. Thomas Neville is best known for his work on Mount Pleasant in Fairmount. So Port Royal was ransacked during the American Revolution. I don't know by who. Even bets either way. So it was abandoned for a while, and then it was occupied by the Lukens family before being abandoned again. And in the 1920s, the mansion, which is beautiful, came to the attention of Henry Francis DuPont, who spotted it one day while he was taking the train. And he saw the mansion, thought it was beautiful, noticed it was dilapidated, and noticed that it was about to be demolished, so he purchased Port Royal for $15,000, which in 1920 money might be 50 grand, and had it dismantled and integrated into his Winterthur estate in Delaware. Winterthur still exists. It's one of the premier, if not like the most famous museum of American decorative arts in the country. And so Port Royal sort of technically still exists. It just exists at Winterthur. So they like incorporated building elements into this parlor. They incorporated it into the entrance of Winterthur. And that happened right here. So 2 Carpenters Company members contributed to this great mansion, and now pieces of it exist today still at Winterthur. And yeah, so where does that leave us? There's a lot to learn still. Frankfurt, as you guys know, has a really rich architectural history. And there are all sorts of connections to Philadelphia's Workshop of the World here in Frankfurt, old churches, a lot of really old row homes that I suspect have company ties. But that's going to take more work on my part to discover those. And I'm excited to work on it. So one note though. So when I say like, oh, this Carpenters Company member built this Carpenter Company member built that, it's kind of an abstract thing in the sense that these members all have their own shops, their own firms, right? Some of the early members probably had enslaved people who worked for them. So unfortunately, because of the way architectural history often works, one guy kind of gets spotlighted as the auteur, and all the people who kind of worked for him don't get as much credit. So just keep that in mind when you remember this tonight. But luckily, it works in my favor because it makes the history a little bit easier to research because Carpenters Company members are really quick to attach their name to things. Yeah, so that's it for this presentation. I do want to just plug one thing. This Saturday at 10 a.m., we are doing a walking tour of Society Hill to talk about the history of historic preservation in Philadelphia and just the history of the neighborhood of Society Hill. Nothing to do necessarily with Frankfurt, but it'll be really interesting, and it's part of the series that we have going on called Changing the Face of the City. So if you go on our website, you'll see that for the rest of the year, we're doing talks related to the history of the city of Philadelphia and other cities. And yeah, so finally, I just wanted to thank everyone for sitting through this and being here with me tonight as I talk about this stuff and inviting me. So yeah, thank you. Thank you guys. Cheers. So I think that there's going to be snacks. And if you guys have questions, do I stay up here for questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you know about those other buildings that are on the same property right next to Carpenters Hall?
Oh, that's a good point. So we have New Hall, right? Let me go back to the first slide.
Would you repeat the question?
Oh, yes, of course. So there was a question about the buildings directly adjacent to Carpenters Hall and whether or not they have connections to the company itself, right? So this building here is called New Hall. And if you have been to Old City, it's probably best known as the Military Museum. It's only open a few days a year, but that building is actually a replica that was built in the 1960s of the same exact building. It was a little bit larger back then, but the original building was also called New Hall, and it was constructed in the 19th century for the Carpenters Company. It was the new hall for the Carpenters Company, and so it was kind of like an overflow building. The company held a lot of meetings there. There was some frustration amongst members that Carpenters Hall, the building itself, was so perpetually rented out that the members themselves didn't have often room to do stuff there. Interestingly also, New Hall had in it for a time an architectural school, I want to say during the 1830s and 40s, that was run by William Strickland's brother, George Strickland. If you're not familiar, William Strickland is best known for building the second bank in Old City. But so George Strickland ran this school out of New Hall that's there. So this building definitely has a tie to Carpenters Hall, right? Now, further down, out of view of this image, there's a building called the Pemberton House. That building has no connection that I know of to the Carpenters Company, and it's kind of a, what's the word? Sort of a historical building, although I hesitate to say that because I don't know that much about it. It was built as a replica of the bicentennial. Other buildings in that immediate area are the Todd House. That was also a Carpenters Company project, although I forget the name of the guy associated with it at this time. And then behind is that series of row homes, the Bishop White House and all that stuff. That was also all built by the Carpenters Company. And so Old City especially is an area where the Carpenters Company has a lot of influence, right? So like St. George's Church, the Decoration House, Independence Hall I talked about, St. George's Church, Arch Street Meeting House, the Betsy Ross House. All these buildings have connections to the company because the company built them. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. The influence kind of wanes, right, as you radiate out from Old City itself, because these boroughs and counties and villages that are around Philadelphia before the incorporation, have enough distance from where the company itself is based that there are other people who come by, and other architects. And as time goes on, I should have mentioned this as part of the main part of my talk, but as the 19th century goes on, the influence of the company itself wanes and is challenged as time goes on, but especially as the company becomes more focused on the centennial, right? And obviously also with the creation of a strong municipal and federal and state government, a lot of the regulatory stuff that the company was caught up in was kind of taken away from them, But anyway, sorry, long answer, but hopefully that's helpful. Any other questions, thoughts, feelings? Or else? No.
Are we able to get remote questions?
Any remote questions?
Sometimes we get
None seen.
none. Okay. Couple of quick things.
Thumbs up would be the only comment.
Thumbs up. That's a good one.
Yeah.
We, local tradition has it that Frankfurt goes back not to 1682, but to 1660,
Oh, interesting.
which is based, every time I track one of those claims down, it seems to go back to John Fanning Watson, who wrote Watson's Annals of Philadelphia. And he claimed that we had a Swedish mill in 1660. What's your authority on 1682?
So the 1682 date comes from some of the kind of articles and stuff I read online about Frankfurt. Although that talks, like those sources kind of talked about that as being the date when the Quakers came, right? Which to me makes sense, but it's totally possible. In fact, probably likely that there were Swedish European settlers here, and then Lenape certainly before that.
Yes, the Lenape go back to the memory of man, runneth not to the conjure.
Yeah. But
Here,
the
I mean specifically here.
Yeah, the Swedish were probably here, already.
The Swedish were definitely here well before 1682.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's one, and then the other, where we're sitting right now, this building was built in the orchard, what had been the orchard of the Jellicoe's Tavern.
Oh yeah. Susan mentioned that to me actually. Yeah.
Which is quite interesting. I think this must have been floodplain when Frankfurt Creek was a free-running torrent, much bigger than it is now. And I think that the reason this was an orchard specifically was that it was much enriched by being flooded.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So
thank you.
we're sitting on the property of the Jellicoe's.
We are.
Okay.
We are indeed.
I
And
have
not to mention the Lenape who occupied the space for long before that, and probably farmed it.
I had a question actually for you guys, since you all are probably the closest to a collective authority on this, that exists. So a couple of people have mentioned to me that, and this has nothing to do with Carpenters Hall, the Carpenters Company, that the intersection of Cheltenham and Frankfurt Ave is the only intersection in America that has a cemetery on each corner. Is that true? I know that is true, technically, from the fact that there are cemeteries there. So far as we know? Okay. Because people have said that to me, and I'm like, I've not been able to find whether or not it's true. I would love, that's so cool to me, but.
Everybody knows it's a remarkable point.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you guys. Thank you. If you have any questions at all, go to the Carpenters Hall website. My name, my email's right there. You can call us, or come up to me after. And again, it's been such a pleasure and so honored to be here. Thank you guys. And come to the programs next month and the month after. It's monthly, right? Second Tuesday.
Second Tuesday, 8 times a year.
8 times a year. All right. Thank you. Take care, guys.